Okay. And so we're beginning. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sean McLaughlin. I am the director of the Basilian Spirituality Center. We are a Ukrainian Greek Catholic apostolate because we are a ministry of the Sisters of the Order of St. Basil the Great. And this program is about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in America, and more specifically in the United States. We could do a whole program on the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Canada too, but I'm just going to limit the scope a bit to the United States. And even then, there's so much to talk about. So what I'm hoping to offer is something of a high-level overview to give you some of the most important moments and important issues in the history of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, especially its first 50 years or so, points for further discussion. And then if there's really significant interest, I can delve more into it in a future program. All right? Okay. So here's our introduction. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has a rich history, though few know it. So I wonder, how did Ukrainian Catholicism establish itself in the United States? And what are some important moments from the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church's history? So that's the focus of the presentation. And the two sources I'm relying on the most are, this is Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak's biography of her uncle, Konstantin Bohachevsky. He was the second Greek Catholic bishop of Philadelphia and the first, technically speaking, for the Ukrainian Catholic Church, because Soto Ortinsky was the bishop for all Greek Catholics in the United States. It's a work of formidable scholarship, and she is an alumna of St. Basil Academy, so she was educated by the Sisters of St. Basil, and it's a great book, and there's tons of really interesting information. So that's kind of one of my main sources. And then the other one is Father Ivan Kostiak. He is a pastor up at Holy Trinity in Kerhonkson, New York, a little bit north of New York City. And he was nice enough a year ago to come and speak, and the talk he gave is posted to our YouTube channel. But he's a scholar and a historian, and he's written a lot about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, about Shevtinsky, about Ortinsky. So I encourage you to check out his scholarship. So I have some of his research in the back of my mind too as I'm doing this program. So both Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak and Father Ivan Kostiak, those are great sources, really authoritative with respect to the history of Ukrainian Catholicism in the United States. And I encourage you to check out their work.
Oh, get him.
Right, I'm just gonna make sure we're all muted here. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right, some important moments in Ukrainian Greek Catholic history. Well, first, in 1880, the earliest groups of Ukrainians settled in the United States, especially in the Pennsylvania coal regions. So the first toehold that Ukrainian Catholics really had was in the coal region, like Schuylkill County and up that way, so north and west of Philadelphia. In 1907, Bishop Ortinsky is named as bishop for all Greek Catholics in the United States, and he's based in Philadelphia. But the scope of his jurisdiction extends beyond the Ukrainians, although that's most of the group for whom he was responsible. In 1916, Ortinsky dies. His death was very untimely and unexpected, and there was a major problem because two groups of Ukrainians, on the one hand those from Halichina and the others from the Carpathians, there were disagreements. So the Carpatho-Rusin Ukrainians were more influenced by the Hungarian side of things, further west and south, whereas the Halichinans were more influenced by the Halichina. So although they're both Ukrainian, there were disagreements and slight cultural differences. And so the Vatican had an issue because if they appointed, both of these groups wanted a bishop to suit their own purposes and from their own, one of their own to be appointed bishop. And so Rome was kind of stuck because they couldn't find a suitable candidate that would satisfy both groups. So eventually what ended up happening was nothing for 8 years. And then after 8 years, finally, Konstantin Bohachevsky is named for the Ukrainians, and Basil Takak is named as bishop for the Carpatho-Rusins and other groups. So Rome ended up appointing two bishops to prevent alienating either group. I'll talk more about that. The next major and horrible moment in the history of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is that back in Ukraine, the church is forced underground when the Soviet Union takes over Ukraine after the Second World War. And that had tremendous effects in the States. On a more positive note, in 1958, Philadelphia was elevated to the level of a metropolitan archieparchal see. And this really signified that the papacy was recognizing that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, it wasn't just, missionary work for immigrants, it was permanent in the United States. So it's a landmark moment. In the 60s, of course, from 62 to 65, we have the Second Vatican Council. This affected the Roman Church, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and all the other churches sui juris in Catholicism. In 1963, Cardinal Joseph Suplee he was not yet a cardinal, but he was released from Soviet prison. He was a profoundly important figure in the history of the Ukrainian Church and influenced, for example, our current Archbishop Boris Kodziak. And then in 1979, John Paul II visits Philadelphia, the United States, including Philadelphia, and he stops at the Immaculate Conception Cathedral, which is our Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral in Philadelphia, on October 4 of that year. So there's a monument to his visit there, and there's video of it. So it's a really meaningful occasion for the whole Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but especially the Archieparchy of Philadelphia, which is where we are, Basilian Spirituality Center, where we're located. So that's high-level overview of some of the important moments. Let me give some introductory remarks, and then I will proceed to the main part of my presentation. Okay, just as a refresher, or perhaps as an introduction for those of you who may not know, Volodymyr the Great Christianized Kievan Rus. He was the king of Kievan Rus in 988. So that's how Christianity reached the Slavs, the Eastern Slavs. And even though the term Ukrainian originates in the 1100s, in the 12th century, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was known as the Ruthenian Catholic Church of the Byzantine Rite until the Second Vatican Council. Okay, so you'll see documentation of the Ukrainian Church in the States before the mid-60s, and it's always the Ruthenian Catholic Church. And the reason is that all Greek Catholics, or all Catholics belonging to the Byzantine Rite in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were known as Ruthenian. It was a catch-all term. It was only later that there were more specific designations. Later on, Ruthenian came to signify those from the Transcarpathian region as opposed to those from the Halychina region. So today, there are two churches sui juris. You've got the Ukrainian Church and then the Ruthenian Church. But in the United States, early on, there was no separation. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was established in 1596 after the Union of Brest. And because of that union or reunification with Rome, it became an example of how unity could be achieved between the Eastern Orthodox churches and the papacy without suppressing or otherwise violating Eastern practice. So the issue is that over the centuries, the Eastern churches, they have a different liturgical heritage than that of Rome. And the question was, after the Great Schism of 1054, if we were going to come back together, how could we do it without losing our identity? Well, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is the model for that because they entered back into communion with Rome, but they retained all of the Byzantine Slavonic divine liturgy, the divine office, the prayers, sacramentals, etc. Okay, so, and this is also notable because in the early 20th century, there was renewed interest in bringing the Orthodox churches back into communion with Rome, not just the Ukrainian Church, which had already done that, the ones that had not, like, for example, the Russian Orthodox Church. And people were pointing to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as a model. So it's pretty interesting, and I think it's cool to think about that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was sort of intrepid in that sense, that they pioneered this way to come back into union with Rome without losing their Byzantine identity. Here's a timeline just showing some highlights. So again, Volodymyr the Great, who was the leader of Kievan Rus, he Christianized that kingdom in 988. Unfortunately, less than a century later, Rome and Constantinople break communion. So everybody in the Latin West is default Catholic. Everybody in the East is by default Orthodox. And over the centuries, some groups came back into union with Rome, like the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church through the Union of Brest, which happens in 1596. Also in the background of the kind of Catholic Orthodox split is the fall of Constantinople, and the Ottoman Turks overtook the city in 1453. And then the last moment, which is very important, is, as I said before, 1958, John the 23rd recognizes an archbishopric in the United States for the Ukrainian Catholics. Up until this point, Philadelphia was an exarchate, which is a temporary entity, whereas a diocese or an eparchy are more permanent. So it was formal recognition by the papacy that Ukrainian Catholics in the United States were here to stay. Okay? All right. Just as a reminder, there are 24 churches sui juris in Catholicism. Okay, the largest is the Roman or Latin Church, and that constitutes 98% of Catholicism. But that other 2% is divided among 23 other particular churches or churches sui juris. Sui juris is a Latin term that means of their own law because they're self-governing. They appoint their own bishops and they, administer their own church necessities. Of the 23 Eastern Catholic churches, so that is all those churches sui juris that are not the Latin Church, the Ukrainian Church is the largest. And this is due mostly to its growth in the 20th century United States and Canada. So that's why this topic is so important, is that the largest Eastern Catholic Church is the Ukrainian Church, and it's really because of people like Ortinsky and Bohachevsky who made that happen. So the Ukrainian Church has much to thank the States and Canada for. And you can see there are 14 churches of the Byzantine Rite. I have the arrow pointing to the Ukrainian Church, but others would be like the Russian Greek Catholic Church or the Albanian Greek Catholic Church, etc. Okay, so worldwide, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is led by Major Archbishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk, and his cathedral is that of St. George. Every bishop has a church, which is called his cathedral, and his is St. George in Lviv. So here's an image of St. George. Lviv is in the west of Ukraine. It's a beautiful Baroque church, and you can see the interior there on the right. And just for reference, here's where Lviv is. Now I'm going to talk about the fact Lviv has changed hands many times. So its location close to Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, that's significant, and that manifests in the city's history. But we're well west of Kiev and Odessa, much closer to the Latin West than any other part of Ukraine. Okay. A note about Greek Catholics in Ukraine. The historic meaning of the name Ukraine, the name of the country, it's said to be borderland. And that makes sense because Ukraine is the borderland between the Latin West and the Byzantine East. It's also the borderland between Central Europe and Eastern Europe. It's the borderland between a number of powers over the years. So the name is appropriate. Western Ukraine, as far as Ukraine goes, is the Catholic heartland, okay? And at the same time, that area is an especially active cultural and political crossroads. So I like to use Lviv as a case study. So during the 20th century alone, Lviv was controlled by at least 4 different nations or states. The Austro-Hungarian Empire before the First World War. Then between the First and Second World Wars, Lviv was controlled by the Second Polish Republic. And then after the Second World War, it was part of Soviet Ukraine, so the Soviet Union controlled Lviv. And then today, it's part of independent Ukraine. And there was also briefly a Western Ukrainian Republic. I didn't include that, but so that's why I said there are at least 4. You could argue, there's even more than 4 empires or states that have control Lviv. But the point is that where you find Ukrainian Catholics in Ukraine, that's where there's been a lot of political overturn and a lot of cultural exchange. The cultural and religious tensions in Western Ukraine followed immigrants to the United States. Okay, so for example, the Ruthenian-Ukrainian split, and also the perennial concerns of Latinization versus retaining the Byzantine identity. The same things that people are arguing about around Lviv, we find people arguing about in Philadelphia. All right. So that's it for my introductory remarks. And now we'll go to the main section of the presentation. And again, the 2 questions that I'm using to frame this is, how did the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church establish itself in the United States? and what are some of the most important moments? All right, so in short, how did the Ukrainian Church establish itself in the United States? Well, it goes back to the first wave of Ukrainian immigration, which lasted approximately 1880 to 1914. This occurred while Western Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so these people arrive in the States, and there's no diocese or eparchy yet. And eventually some priests arrive to minister to them. And what's really beautiful about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is that the laity wasted no time in building parishes. Ukrainian immigrants cherished the Byzantine Rite liturgy as vital to their spirituality and sacrificially invested their money and energy into building local parishes, schools, and a seminary system consisting of a high school, college, and theologiate in Washington. So this testifies to their commitment and values. Okay, why is this notable? Well, it wasn't that there weren't Catholic churches in the States already. There were, but they were, of course, of the Latin Rite. But the Ukrainians valued their Byzantine Rite, so the laity got together and said, you know what, we're going to build our own churches. So during what Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak calls the formative period of Ukrainian Catholicism in the United States, which is 1884 to 1924, we have already close to 300 Ukrainian Greek Catholic parishes. That's pretty significant. You know, that's a 40-year period. And again, these are mostly, the initiative was taken by the laity. It wasn't, the hierarchy was not telling people what to do and how to organize. What's also interesting is that, you know, the laity set up most of these parishes before 1924, but they didn't pay much attention to legal or canonical regulations. They just kind of built the churches and maybe looked for a priest later. And this caused tremendous headaches when Bohachevsky becomes the first Ukrainian Catholic bishop of the United States, because he had to sort out all of these complexities with, you know, in this town, a group of people own the church. In this other town, it's, you know, I don't know, a fraternal organization. In this town, maybe it's like one family that donated most of the money. It just took a really long time to sort that out. Okay, as the church was establishing itself in the United States, it also built a parochial school system parallel to that of the Roman Catholics. But these, rather than being staffed by Roman Catholic nuns like the IHM sisters or the Sisters of St. Joseph, they were staffed by Greek Catholic nuns, especially the Sisters of St. Basil. So the Sisters of St. Basil were critical for the development of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the United States. And then finally, part of the Ukrainian Church establishing itself was the first two bishops, Ortinsky and Bohachevsky. So Ortinsky was bishop from 1907 until his death in 1916. And as I said, there was a vacancy for 8 years before Bohachevsky was named for the Ukrainians of Galicia in 1924. Okay. I spoke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before, but here is roughly what it consisted of. So it's right smack dab in the middle of Central Europe, and it bleeds over into parts of Western Ukraine. So the first wave of immigrants, you know, it's funny, if you looked on their passport, it doesn't really, you know, it would say Austria-Hungary, I guess, does not faithfully represent their ethnicity. But that's what controlled Western Ukraine at that time. So that first wave, which lasted about 1880 to 1914, so pre-World War I, that was about 250,000 people. And they fled the Austro-Hungarian Empire mostly for economic reasons. So they came to the States, especially states like Pennsylvania. They went out to the coal mines. They were cheap laborers and they worked hard. And so they found many jobs in the coal region, especially in the coal region of Pennsylvania. The second wave was smaller, and that happened after the First World War and before the Second. That was about 12,000 people. I'm not so sure about that. I couldn't get what I took to be a reliable number, but I mean, it was certainly more than 10,000. They came for social and political reasons. So it was before the Soviet Union, you know, dissolved the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. But there may have been some political motivations, but I say that the reason they came, there were social reasons, political reasons, and economic reasons. After the Second World War, the same thing. This time it was about 85,000 people who came. And then the fourth wave, which has come since the fall of the Soviet Union, so since about 1991 to the present, their reasons for coming are mostly economic because they can make a better life in the United States. And there's at least 250,000 people. There's probably many more. But again, it's difficult to find reliable numbers. But commonly, people speak of these 4 waves. And there's over 1 million people in the United States claiming Ukrainian heritage. So they become a major part of the states, especially in cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York. Okay, I mentioned the Pennsylvania coal region. So that first wave, they settled especially here, Schuylkill County. So north of Allentown, north of Harrisburg, but below Scranton, right in there. That's where a lot of anthracite can be found in the ground, and that's where the first wave really settled. What was the first wave experience like? Well, it's interesting because bishops and priests of the long-established Latin Catholic Church, long established in the United States, that is, they offered Eastern Catholic immigrants a varied reception, ranging from a lack of understanding and respect to indifference and outright hostility. Disputes arose about the validity of Ukrainian Catholic liturgical, canonical, and theological traditions. Okay, Roman Catholic clergy in the States resented the Greek Catholics because they had married priests and apparently rowdy congregations. That's what Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak reports. Now, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were times when the Roman Catholic Church was really expanding in the United States, and there were tremendous efforts to keep things organized and disciplined, to keep people moral, in order, and to not risk losing them to Protestantism or whatever. So, of course, they should have known better than to take issue with the Byzantine Rite and with the married priests. But I would say, in fairness to them, there were a lot of risks in the New World, and the church was established, but it was by no means sure that it was going to continue to grow, as it eventually did. So I understand why some of the Roman clergy were reluctant, Okay, so, but there were positives during this period too, notably support of Eastern Catholic identity from like Pope Leo XIII. So Pope Leo XIII, famously the working man's pope, his reign was 1878 to 1903. He issued the famous encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was about working conditions of the working poor and the industrial workers. And he was very supportive. Pope Benedict XV was also very supportive of Eastern Catholics. He was Pope a little bit later. But the point was that maybe on the ground, it wasn't always pleasant between Eastern Catholics and Roman Catholics, but certainly officially they had the support of the papacy. And this was especially clear in the conflict between Ukrainian Catholics in Western Ukraine and the Roman Catholics of Poland, because they were constantly trying to Polonize the Ukrainian Catholics, to make them of the Latin Rite, to make them Polish, and the papacy stepped in to help prevent that from happening. So the Ukrainian Catholics enjoyed papal support during this time, even if on the ground it wasn't always there. So when the Ukrainian Church takes root in the United States, as I said, it does so in Pennsylvania and the coal regions. The first officially authorized Ukrainian Catholic missionary priest celebrated his first liturgy in the United States in 1884 in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania. And that same year, the first Ukrainian Catholic Church was built as well. So both in 1884, both in Shenandoah. So the first Divine Liturgy was in a rented hall, and then later that year they finished St. Michael's. And there's a picture there that's from Father Ivan Kostiak, who has done tireless research about these country churches. All right. In 1907, Sodor Ortinsky is named bishop for all Greek Catholics in the United States. Here he is depicted, and you can see in the background the double snake, which looks east to west, which represents the scope of Byzantine Christianity. Ortinsky, consecrated in 1907, he purchases an old Protestant church in Philadelphia to use as his cathedral. And unfortunately, he dies in 1916. And then Rome does not appoint a bishop for 8 years. Now, in the meantime, by about 1920, there were 500,000 Ukrainian Catholics in the United States, including more than 200 priests and about 300 parishes. So there was definitely a need for a bishop. But as I said, there were these ethnic conflicts between the Ukrainians from the Carpathian region and those from the region. So after having no Ukrainian Catholic bishop for about 8 years, Pius XI finally decides to name 2 bishops to avoid the conflict of. Okay, so hold on one second. See if I can. Okay. Let's see. All right. So the bishop for the Ruthenians, those Ukrainians from the Carpathian regions, is Basil Takich, and the bishop for the Ukrainians from Halichina is Konstantin Bohachevsky. Now they're named as bishops of 2 exarchates. One's in Philadelphia, and the one they weren't sure where it was going to go. Eventually, it goes to Pittsburgh. The bishops decided that the best way to delineate the 2 exarchies, and they had to delineate them because they overlapped, would be for individual parishes to vote on where they were going to go. Were they going to identify as more Carpathian or Halichinan? Okay, so, and the thought is that these bishops assumed this was going to be temporary. This was a temporary solution that Rome came up with to get episcopal oversight for the Ukrainians without alienating either the Halichinans or the Carpathians. Now, eventually, it persisted, but at the time, it seemed like it was temporary. So Bohachevsky starts for the Halichinans. He's in Philadelphia. He takes over Ortinsky's cathedral and uses his vestments.
Ringing the doorbell,
and when he started as bishop, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the U.S. was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they were even going to lose the cathedral. So the parishes were mismanaged.
No, I'm doing my class right now.
Now he was a really.
Can you call me back on the cell?
Okay, there we go. So he was a very good, very organized leader, and it took a long time, but eventually he really built up the Archieparchy of Philadelphia. Now, during his reign, he reigned until the 60s. We have the Ukraine's Soviet period, which lasted 1946 to 1991. So the Soviet government formally dissolved the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine in 1946. So they forcibly abolished the church, arresting and executing its leadership and pushing the church underground. This is really important for the United States context because the role of the American church became really, really important. In Western Europe, the Ukrainian churches functioned in small immigrant communities like in Rome, in the Netherlands, in England, but the Ukrainian church in America was coming into its own and was gaining public recognition, which culminates in the 1958 elevation of Philadelphia to an archieparchial see. So here's approximately the size of the Soviet Union. You can see it takes over all of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, parts of Georgia, and that down that way. And this was a huge disaster for Ukraine. I mean, first you had the Holodomor in the 30s, the forcible starvation were killing millions of Ukrainians. And then when the Soviet Union took over, more people died. So the middle of the 20th century was a very unhappy one for Ukraine, the middle and late 20th century. Okay, after the Second World War, the unfortunate events of 1945 and 1946, which forced the Ukrainian Catholics underground, the faithful in the United States continued without significant leadership with Ukraine. They couldn't really communicate because everybody was hiding or dead or in exile in Siberia. Because of the Soviet atrocities following World War II and the Ukrainian church's dissolution, the survival of Ukrainian Catholicism really fell upon the diaspora in Canada and the United States. So this is when the church in America becomes very, very important. But it wasn't without, and it grew, but it wasn't without its own problems because you had issues of Americanization and assimilation on one hand. And then on the other hand, you have new people arriving, different generation, about 85,000 people. So there's tensions even within the Ukrainian Catholic Church during this time after World War II. And simultaneously, the Orthodox churches pose a major challenge because they're constantly proselytizing, trying to get Catholics to become Orthodox. They're denouncing Catholicism. And tens of thousands of Ukrainian Catholics did become Russian Orthodox over the years. So it was a real, risk. But in 1958, again, we have Philadelphia becomes an archieparchial see. And this was a major moment because historically in Roman Catholicism, you never have more than one bishop of the same rank in the same city. In the ancient in the Byzantine East, especially in ancient times, it was very different because the dioceses and the eparchies were much smaller. But in Central and Western Europe and then the States, they did not put more than one bishop of the same rank in the same place. You might have auxiliary bishops who are subordinate to the main bishop. They could be in the same place, but not two different bishops. They would be in different sees. But in 58, when they made the Exarchate of Philadelphia and Archeparchial See, they broke with this. So like today, Archbishop Boris Gudziak and Archbishop Nelson Perez, who are the Ukrainian and the Roman Catholic bishops respectively, they're of the same rank. And, obviously their sees overlap. They're in the same city. But it's not a problem because each church is sui juris, but that was a new thing. And also just some interesting background. In the early 20th century, the papacy still thought of Catholicism in America as a missionary endeavor. It was only in 1908 that Pius X said, okay, Latin Rite Catholics in the States, they are officially part of the church. And Catholicism had been established in the States since, I think the earliest church is early 16th century. It's a Spanish missionary church out in California or New Mexico. But in Philadelphia, the Jesuits established a church in the 1740s. So, there were churches. St. Augustine, the Spanish, established a church even before then. So Latin Catholicism was well established, but it took centuries for Rome to say, okay, this is permanent. It's no longer a missionary territory. So the Latin or the Roman Catholics only got that in 1908, and 50 years later, the Ukrainian Catholics got it. Bohachevsky's death in 1961 signified the end of an era. He played a crucial role in developing the Ukrainian church in the United States from his installation in 1924 until his death. And part of that development included a liturgical hybridization. And that's mixing the Latin and Byzantine facets of the liturgy. I spoke before about these pressures between Americanization and assimilization on one hand and then newly arriving immigrants on the other. And there have always been conflicting pressures on the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the States. People say, should we Latinize or should we retain and strengthen our Byzantine identity? Should we be more American-facing or should we stay culturally grounded in Ukraine? Should we train American clergy or should we bring over Ukrainian clergy? Should we use Slavonic in the liturgy or contemporary Ukrainian? Should we keep the old calendar or adopt the new calendar? Should we adopt popular Latin devotions like devotion to Jesus' Sacred Heart or the Stations of the Cross? Or should we not do that because that's for Roman Catholics and we're not Roman Catholics? So there are all these conflicting pressures and they're ongoing. And I don't know that there's a specific answer. If there is, I certainly don't know what it is. But it's just interesting to see that when you have the church's sui juris abroad in other contexts, outside of their country or the area where they were born, you run into issues like this. All right, in 1978, this was a huge moment because John Paul II made a historic visit to Philadelphia and he stopped at the Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. I'm sorry, in 79. So there's a commemorative kind of monument there for that. And it was a tremendous moment for the Ukrainian church and especially for the faithful in the United States. And there were many people assembled there. There's video of it on YouTube. So fast forwarding to today, there are 4 eparchies or dioceses in the United States. Philadelphia is the first in terms of, official importance because it's an archeparchy. Then we have the eparchies of Stanford, Parma, Ohio, which is near Cleveland, and Chicago. So you can see they're kind of all in a line and grouped by major industrial centers and nothing west of Chicago. So if you're in California, you're part of the eparchy of Chicago. It's quite far. Here's a list of the leadership of the Archeparchy of Philadelphia, not counting Ortinsky. So, I'm talking a lot about Bohachevsky, and then today we have Archbishop Boris Gudziak. So these are our archbishops over the years. So Archeparchy of Philadelphia was established formally in 1924, although Ortinsky was appointed in 1907. And this is a photo of our Metropolitan Archbishop, Boris Gudziak. Here is his cathedral, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. And this is modeled on the Hagia Sophia, which has recently been in the news. I'm going to talk a little bit about the architecture in just a few minutes, but you get a sense of this 3D vision. So this is just north of Center City, Philadelphia. Here's the Eparchy of Parma, led by Bishop Bohdan Danilo. Parma was established in 1983. Here is Bishop Danilo's cathedral. This is the St. Josephat Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral in Parma. The Eparchy of Stanford is led by Bishop Paul Komnicki. He is a Basilian monk, and the Eparchy of Stanford was established in 1956. Here is his cathedral, St. Vladimir's in Stanford. And then we have the Eparchy of Chicago, led by Bishop Benedict. Chicago was established in 1961, and here is the cathedral. This is the St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral in Chicago. All right. Now, I said that the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Philadelphia is based on the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia was built about 1,500 years ago. This was supposed to be the main church of the Byzantine East. And on the left there, that's the original plan. But when the Ottoman Turks conquered in 1453, they built onto it and added these Islamic minarets that you see there. So just you can compare the original plan to today. And what I hope you'll notice is the domes and the use of these arches. They're perfectly round arches. Here's a cross section. You could see them there too. And this is in what was Constantinople, which we know today is Istanbul. And the inside of the Philadelphia Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral is modeled on this. So take a look at the interior there. You see those perfect semicircular arches. Well, they're inspired by the Hagia Sophia. And the dome of the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception is also inspired by the dome of the Hagia Sophia. So you can see the likeness there. Just a note about architecture. So, in the Byzantine East, these semicircular arches are used. In the Latin West, we sort of had those. We call them Romanesque arches. But there was a major innovation in the Middle Ages about 900 years ago, moving from the Romanesque or the semicircular to the pointed arch or the Gothic arch. Now, this is the Collegiate Church of St. Mary and St. Alexius. This is in Tum, Poland, so it's pretty close to Ukraine. And you can see it's still using those Romanesque arches. And it's not a very high building. There's not a lot of light because the windows are very small, because architecturally, that Romanesque arch can only support so much weight. But when there's this major innovation in the Gothic period, again, around the year 1100, 900 years ago, when you get that pointed arch, all of a sudden you can build much higher, and the arches, so you can let in much more light. So we look at, this is the Cathedral of Milan, and it's much more architecturally sophisticated, and the interior is much brighter than this older Romanesque cathedral. So the point is that architecture really, the limits of architectural technology dictate what churches look like. And in the Byzantine East, they were much more, I think, able to work with that semicircular arch than they were in the Latin West. And it took the innovation of the Gothic pointed arch for the Latin West to be able to build higher and brighter. There it is. Okay, so some conclusions. Once again, this is a timeline. Ukrainian Catholicism comes when Volodymyr the Great Christianizes Kievan Rus in 988. Less than a century later, most regrettably, there is the Great Schism when Rome and Constantinople break communion with one another. The city of Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. In 1596, the Union of Brest is completed, which brings a portion of the Ukrainian Church back into communion with Rome for the first time in 500 years. So that's where the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church really originates, as we know it today. And then in 1958, Pope John XXIII recognizes the Philadelphia See as an archbishopric, which is a major moment in the history of Ukrainian Catholicism. How did Ukrainian Catholicism establish itself in the United States? Well, we saw there was that first wave of immigration where they came mostly to work on the coal mines, but also some industrial jobs in the big city. And the laity wasted no time in building parishes. There was some missionary activity by priests, but the first Episcopal leadership was only started in 1907, and that was Sotor Ortinsky. Now, he was the bishop for all Greek Catholics in the United States, and he had an untimely death in 1916. After that, there was no Greek Catholic bishop in the United States for 8 years until Rome appointed two, one for the Halichinans and one for the Carpatho-Rusins. So Bohachevsky was the bishop for the former, based in Philadelphia, and he reigned from 24 to 61. Ukrainian Catholic immigrants to the United States, as I said, they came from different places, like within the Habsburg Empire. And that little line explains the Halichinan-Ruthenian difference. All right, some important moments. In 1946, when the Soviet Union forcibly abolished the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Ukraine, it arrested or executed leadership, pushed the church underground. The American church became even more important. The American church was able to grow in liberty and freedom and to just flourish, while the church in Ukraine was hiding, waiting to come out, which it was finally able to do, thank God, after the fall of the Soviet Union, about 1991. And in the last 50 years, influenced by the Second Vatican Council and the Eastern Code of Canon Law, the Ukrainian church has achieved modest liturgical change. And that modest change manifests the sort of tension between, do we Latinize, do we stay Byzantine? What does it mean to stay Byzantine? These are things that liturgists debate. I talked about the 4 Ukrainian eparchies in the United States. We've got Philadelphia, Stanford, Parma, and Chicago. Here are the 4 bishops in each of the 4 cathedrals. Remember, every bishop has a cathedral. That's true for all Catholicism. And here they are on a map, mostly towards the east of the United States, northern east. And just last lines here. Ukraine is a borderland in many ways, and Lviv is a great case study. As I've talked about, Lviv changed hands at least 4 times in the 20th century. First, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had it, then the Second Polish Republic, then the Soviet Union, then the independent Ukraine. So a lot of those cultural and religious tensions that emerged from this land as being a borderlands and being a crossroads followed immigrants to the United States, and we see that in the Ruthenian-Ukrainian split and concerns of Latinization. So the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is the largest of the Eastern Catholic churches. This is mainly due to its growth in the United States during the 20th century and Canada. Looking to the future, I think there's tremendous hope, especially because Roman Catholics are interested, even captivated by the Byzantine liturgy, by icons, etc. So a number of Roman Catholics are converting to Byzantine Catholicism, either the Ukrainian Church or the Ruthenian Church or whatever. And many Roman Catholic churches today have icons in them. So, the Byzantine churches are always worried about Latinization, but the Latin church embraces Byzantinization. And here are some of my select sources. So I'm going to stop recording.